Awesome. So I think we're going to get started while folks join us in the next few minutes. But just some instructions as we share this space today in this virtual Zoom room. Marian and I will be presenting on the Just Food Learning modules today, and we'll be kind of facilitating a little Q&A towards the end, as well as some group discussions in breakout rooms in a bit. Just to let folks know, this session will be recorded, so feel free to turn off your cameras and mics if you don't want to be included in the recording, or whatever is most comfortable for you to do. And so we want to just begin by acknowledging that these learning modules were developed, and the work that we'll be sharing about today was done on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded homelands of the Musqueam people at the University of British Columbia, and what we now know as Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. And so for Marian and myself, as students and as settlers on these lands, we believe that a critical part of engaging in equitable food justice pedagogy is centering Indigenous histories in our teaching and learning practices. And so within the context of this workshop, acknowledging these lands is an important first step in furthering the work that we'll be exploring and discussing today. And so with the content that we'll be presenting on, if you are a settler like us, we encourage you to question how you and your learners and communities have benefited and continue to benefit from being on Indigenous lands. And in using this resource, we hope that you will continue to think about how you can center Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, voices, and communities in the work that you do, and in delivering these various learning modules that we'll be introducing today. And so because we have a really short time together, we want to know who's in the room with us this afternoon. So I'm just going to invite all of you to share and introduce yourselves in the chat. Maybe your name, whose lens are you calling in from today, and what brings you here this afternoon. And feel free to throw that in the chat as we move on with the presentation anytime. And so just to hop on a brief agenda, an overview of today's workshop, we'll be providing a brief review of how this project came to be and where we're landing at today. We'll also be doing a really quick website orientation. Marian will be leading us in a case study to navigate food justice corner. I'm so sorry. We'll be doing a little breakout room discussion, opening up the floor for a Q&A, and then kind of wrapping up in the last 5 minutes. And anytime if you have a question, feel free to also pop that in the chat, and we will definitely get back to you and catch that. So. Awesome. So we're just going to begin by introducing ourselves. My name is Rachel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a fourth-year human geography student at UBC, and I was initially involved when I joined LFS student-directed seminar led by Marian and Joyce, where I was introduced to food justice concepts, and then subsequently joined a team involved in developing the modules, refining the activities, and illustrating and designing the website. I'm currently also the creative communications lead at the UBC Climate Hub, and my interest in climate justice and equity pedagogy drew me to this project.
Thanks, Rachel, for introducing everything and kind of setting the stage for today's workshop. My name's Marian Corkery. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling from unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm also a recent UBC graduate. I was in the Global Resource Systems program, so I studied sustainable food systems in different capacities, and that's kind of what led me into this project. And I've been with the project for the last 2 years, so it's really exciting to be here today and to be able to put this out into the world in some form that people can use and adapt and take from what we've learned in the process. So I've been involved in different capacities. I co-led with Joyce Lau the student-directed seminar and worked on most of the modules in some form. And yeah, just really excited to be here today and to share more about the project. So like Rachel said, we'll kind of start with just an overview of the project. This is a nice simple graphic that makes it seem like we went through this really logical one-by-one step process when in reality it was far from it. This was a primarily student-led project. It was started by students in the faculty, so we learned a lot as we went. So there was definitely a lot of moving back and forth between these stages, but it kind of helps to understand a little bit. So part of the process, it was originally ideated by myself, Joyce, and Colin Dring, a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. I guess 2 years ago was when we first applied for the Teaching and Learning Enhancement Fund application, which provided funding to support the work. And it really started with a desire for our education to center the injustices we saw within our lives and within the food system. Myself, I was studying nutrition and sustainable agriculture and wondering how do we ask these questions about farming on stolen lands and culturally appropriate food if we don't have something in our education that's engaging with those issues. So that was kind of what started it for me. And with Joyce and Colin, it was similar in that they already had interest in this. And then there was just this, it kind of snowballed from there, with starting with a student-directed seminar and then this idea to create open access learning modules, but we'll get to that a bit further. And then we did a bunch of background research. We looked at other food justice courses within Canada and the United States to see how were people teaching about food justice. Food justice there's a lot of activist movement and increasingly more scholarly writing about it, but how are people teaching and engaging with these issues of power, privilege, and equity within the food system? So we wanted to see what was already out there. And through that, one of probably the highlights of the project for me was getting to interview instructors who were asking these really tough questions and engaging with the food system with this critical lens. So that was really exciting for me and for Joyce to be able to interview these instructors and just hear their passion. And it also instilled some passion in us to keep doing this work. And then we also looked at UBC courses that use food as a pedagogical tool. So sociology courses, geography, nutrition courses, how are they engaging with these topics? And all of this helped us to kind of figure out what modules should we do, what topics should we look at, and how should we structure this? And please feel free to tell me to slow down or ask questions in the chat. I'll try and look back. So then there was the module creation. And again, this makes it look like it was module creation, then trialing, then revising, but this was all happening in tandem. So we were creating modules as we were trialing them, as we were revising them. But this included writing and researching the background, creating and modifying learning outcomes, activities, and associated assessments, and creating a facilitator guide, which we'll go through a bit later. But I think that's one of the really key things that came out of this, was not just the learning modules, but some tips and tools on how to engage with these topics and how you can prepare yourself to get to a point where you can facilitate this. And so this was primarily done in a post-secondary situation and context, but it has applicability across different organizations, different structures, that kind of thing. And then we were able to trial out some of the activities and the modules within the student-directed seminar, which was a really awesome opportunity in that not only were we co-facilitating, but then other students would take on facilitation as well. So we figured if students who might not have any facilitation experience can take on these modules and use them, then we've at least done them in an accessible way. Not to give discredit to students or anything, but just to see how can we make these accessible to different people. And it really helped in our process of hearing their feedback and finding out what were the challenging points, what did we need to have more detail on, what more support was needed. And then we also did some workshops with LFS 350 and GRS 290 and 390. So those are courses within the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at UBC. And then some other community workshops, and then again, more feedback from students. So as this was happening, we were also creating new modules, and it really helped inform the process that way. So then we were revising. We had an amazing team of advisors and academics and community members who were able to provide input and really helped us in our own learning as we were dealing with these topics, but then also to make sure that the modules were refined, and we were able to apply those learnings from the student-directed seminar directly by going back and looking at some of the reflections and finding out, okay, which modules, which activities were actually what resonated with students. And then compiling. So we decided to use the wiki website, which is now fed through the WordPress, because we wanted it to be open and accessible. When we're talking about issues of food justice, it's who has access to this knowledge, who has access to what we're making. So for us, we didn't want it to be behind a paywall or only accessible to people at UBC. We wanted to make sure that it was available to everyone. And that's part of what this workshop is too, is to put it out in the world, but then not just leave it there, to make sure it gets into the right hands and to people who want to know more. So, and the great thing about Creative Commons is people can build off of this material. So you can revise it in your own context, and you can adapt it and share it in any way. So these are some of the guiding principles that have guided our work within this project, and they're also from the facilitator guide. So we hope that educators or community members who approach these modules will be able to uphold these principles. So the first one is uphold lived and personal experiences, center marginalized voices while not further burdening, foster an awareness of emotional reactions. The second principle is address power dynamics in the learning environment. Use the physical environment as a way to model different power dynamics, share responsibilities and leadership within the classroom. Foster a community of learners. Co-create community guidelines, write a food justice manifesto, hold each other accountable. So in reflection, we've come to kind of the end of, not the end, but kind of a nice point of reflection in this project where we are putting it out into the world and we can kind of look back on our process and what we did. And I have the great privilege of being with this project for the last 2 years and having that point of reflection and realizing these are not comprehensive. There's so many other ways that you could approach these topics and other modules we could have chosen to focus on. There's just so many different ways to approach. So this is not supposed to be an alternative to land-based learning or to other ways of engaging with food justice. This is an addition. We're still going through some of the final revisions. So these are, as much as we're putting them out into the world, there still will be some changes, such as increasing the accessibility of some of the language and embedding more intersectionality throughout all the modules. And this was also a student-driven project. Like, that's a huge strength, in that we can identify what we need as students and what we wanted to see in our education. But there's also some limitations in terms of resources and time and experience, but we were really supported within the project team. And this is also a 2-year project, so we are able to get some feedback at this point, and we really welcome that feedback. We'll have a survey later on, but we're kind of limited in what we can actually implement. We can't completely change the structure or anything yet, but we really do want to hear what people think and what they think could be changed. So now I'm going to pass it over to Rachel, who's going to do a little bit of a tour of the website and show off some of her amazing illustrations that she did. And then we'll get into things later.
Thanks, Marin. Can you see my screen right now? Is it sharing?
I can see it.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna just do a really quick website run through. So if you visit justfruit.landfruit.ubc.ca, it will bring you to this landing page. And so as Marin mentioned, the Just Fruit project was born from a place of students wanting our education to center issues of injustices that we were witnessing and learning about in our lives. So with the homepage, there's just a really quick welcome, some resources for folks to learn more about land acknowledgements and learning about where we're coming from in approaching these issues on stolen indigenous territories. It's just a welcome from the team. We've also included an email template. If you're a student or a learner here today, there's an email template that you can use to reach out to your instructor to adopt one of these learning modules, or just to incorporate more food justice content in your curriculum. And then there's just some really quick instructions on how to navigate the site. So this is what we're going to be doing today. We'll just be visiting and getting to know the origins and the faces behind the resource, a quick run through of the facilitator guide, looking at the variations of modules that we have, as well as other pages on this website. So apart from Marin and myself, there were 4 other students as well, students from LFS 490, which Sage was a part of. Sage is with us today. And so we just want to acknowledge that today, as well as Colin Dring, who was a PhD candidate, as well as Professor Will Valley, both from the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. And these modules are a result of an iterative process from many revisions and consultations with experts and food educators and communities along the way. And all of their names are just here on the website. And so we jump into the facilitator guide, and you are highly encouraged to begin here and using this resource. The facilitator guide provides really useful tools to examine your own positionality as an educator and ensure that you have the background to be able to facilitate these topics. And so with this, there are pedagogical tools, frameworks, guiding principles, resources that will be helpful in approaching these modules through an equity lens and kind of support the delivery of these modules as well. And some really quick instructions on how to use the modules in terms of the structure of them, which Marin will be introducing in a bit. mean, feel free to explore this page in your own time. There are definitely tons of resources that are available that would be helpful in any forms of pedagogy. And so with the learning modules page, there are 7 food justice modules that you can integrate into your curriculum or your classroom or your programming, and feel free to use what is appropriate in your context, or if you're choosing to focus on a particular topic. We also want to preface that these modules can be considered somewhat of a work in progress, so definitely use them as a starting point to build off your teaching and learning content. And so this is just a really quick overview. So module 1 is the primer. We also encourage you to begin here because it provides an introduction to food systems in general and kind of caters to different levels of knowledge around food justice. And then it kind of segues into different topics around agriculture, disparate food waste, migrant labor, the local food movement, food systems governance, as well as gender equity and food security. And the last page is, I believe, the glossary of terms. So this glossary basically enables you to just search up a term and hopefully be able to find a definition in a way. And this was for us to make sure that the learning modules and the content that we were putting out is accessible to most folks. And so the terms that I used throughout the modules are just compiled on this page. You can feel free to search for a term, and here if you click search, it will probably pop up. I'm gonna give it a quick shot. Okay, well, this is a good demonstration. We probably have to fix that right after. But yeah, I just want to recognize that there are a ton of jargon being used because this resource is targeted at post-secondary students. So this is really a great way to make sure that facilitators and learners of varying knowledge and backgrounds will be able to use these modules alike. And the last page is just the contact us page. So if you have any questions about the project, or if you would just like to provide feedback and changes, or even if you're wanting to get involved with further iterations of this project, feel free to reach out to us, and you can always use this form on the page. So that's it from me, and I'll pass my time on back to Maren.
Okay, can you see the learning modules page right now? Perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to do a walkthrough of the food justice primer just to kind of get people familiar, and then we'll have some time after for everyone to just explore the website in their own way for about 5 minutes, and then we'll go into some breakout rooms for discussions. But just wanted to let you know where we're headed. So I'm going to go through the primer, and you can access it through the modules here. And so the food justice primer is in some ways very representative of the other modules in terms of the format. That's all consistent, but the primer is a little bit longer than some of the others. So just wanted to preface that just because there's a lot when you're talking about issues of positionality and privilege, and then also the food system. So the great thing about the primer is that we tried to cover all of that, but depending on your context, some of it might be less relevant. So if you come from, say, an environmental studies background, or the people that you're trying to engage the modules with are from that background, then they might not need as much on the food system and the environment. But some of the more social emotional things, they might need to be more familiar with those terms. So that's just a preface. Again, this in trying to make these adaptable to a wide range of applications, there are some things where you have to use your best judgment, and we entrust that in the fact that you're approaching these modules, you'll have the ability to do that. So in the introduction, it just provides a brief overview of the module and some key themes, so that way you can kind of get an idea of where things are headed. Then we have learning outcomes that are associated with each. There's usually about 2 to 4 learning outcomes. And this is great, especially if you're an educator in a post-secondary situation and that you're trying to make sure that these activities and these readings line up with your learning outcomes. But it's also just good if you want to get a feel for what are learners going to get out of this session, what are they going to get out of this module. And then we have a background for each of them. Again, this one's a little bit longer, but it's kind of taking the things that are in the readings and suggested resources and putting them in a more accessible or more succinct way. So for the primer, we talk about how is food justice injustice produced positionality and intersectionality, equity versus equality, power, justice. So just trying to get learners to a point where they can engage with the following activities. Food justice, food security, and food sovereignty. I think that was something that came up in a lot of workshops, is people wanting to understand the differences, and really foundational to being able to engage with food justice. And then each of the modules has the key terms section. So these are defined by us, but we also really encourage educators, if they have the time and capacity, to co-define these terms with the people in the session or in the learning environment, because language changes a lot. Like, we defined these even a year ago, and sometimes there's been changes. So I think that's the beauty of it, is that being able to co-create those definitions, make sure everyone's on the same page. But we have provided definitions here as a starting point. And then we have the activity outlines. So the goal of the way that we structure these is they're about a 90-minute session, but they can also be changed. So if you just want to go through the background, the reading discussion, and then one activity, that would be about 90 minutes. But if you wanted to do a series of workshops, or if you wanted to draw it out a bit more, then you can kind of pick and choose. So that's why we have the estimated times and the associated learning outcomes and some notes with each of the activities. So like I said, the primer is a lot longer. I think we have 9 activities, whereas most of the other ones only have about 3 or 4. But a lot of these deal with the same learning outcomes, so you can kind of pick and choose which one is best for your learners. And I did want to note that these modules were created before the pandemic, so not all of these are adapted to online learning, but a lot of them can be. So in the discussion notes, we do have, like, for example, there's one that says this activity requires physical space. So that one might be a bit harder to actually do in an online format. So we do recommend, especially with the pandemic, to read through the activities first before you decide to go ahead with one of these activities. Yeah, so I'll go through some of the activities that are here, and I've preloaded them because they just bring up in a different window. But each of the modules does suggest creating group guidelines, and then we've created a couple of different options based on the time you have. And again, these are all open access, so we've built on other activities with explicit permission that these can be shared, remixed, and revised. So for example, we have one option that's 20 minutes, another option that's 10 minutes, another option that's 5 minutes. So just really creating a learning environment where people can show up in the way that feels best for them, and to make sure that when we're talking about these issues, we have that kind of underlying trust and have spent time on that. So this is in all of the learning modules. And then we have the reading discussion. So each learning module follows the same template. We have kind of a how-to guide for facilitators. And each activity has a time estimate, optional materials, description, facilitator notes. So you can kind of get a snapshot. And again, shout out to Rachel for making these beautiful PDFs. I would have made them a lot more simple, so she did a great job. And then we have a couple of suggested formats for discussion, a suggested assessment, and then we have the readings and discussion questions. So for each learning module, we have the learning outcomes and then listed resources with discussion questions. By no means are you supposed to do all of these. Our hope is that you just take about one from each learning outcome, and that can be done in different ways, just based on the discipline of your learners or their understandings or kind of how they learn best. We tried to have a mix of academic papers as well as more accessible, free or open access resources, and as well as some videos. I think that was one of the feedback we got from the seminar, was having a mix is really helpful, because we know not everyone wants to read a 20-page paper, and you can get a lot out of different forms of learning. So yeah, so there's quite a few resources and different discussion questions, and then suggested assessments. And then I'll just go through a couple of other activities. So for example, this one's a privilege walk, which we've heard of. So we have the link to the original source and then some suggestions on how to do this. Go through that, and then another sample assessment. We didn't spend as much time on assessments or rubrics or that kind of thing, because we know that a lot of a lot of educators already have their assessment structure or rubrics already made. So we knew that we couldn't make a one size fits all for that. So we really just provided some suggestions on how to assess learners in these activities. And then, for example, this is kind of an example of one of the activities that has a couple of different parts to it that you can modify based on your context. So this one has a pre-activity, but then it also is broken into two separate parts. So there's a part one where you're just defining the terms in a collective way. And then there's kind of a deep dive. So again, depending on what your goals and where your learners are coming into with what kind of level of understanding they have, this can be really helpful because you could bypass the first part. So some of the activities do have that, and we have those listed in the notes on the activity outline. And yeah, so that's kind of the module in a nutshell, and they're all housed on the wiki, so that's why they come through in this kind of formatting, so they can be remixed. And yeah, I think at this point, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. That's kind of all we're gonna do for talking at you folks right now. So we're gonna give about 5 minutes where we just encourage everyone to look at the website and poke around, and then we'll be breaking everyone into breakout groups where we have some discussions. So at this point, Rachel, if you could put the link in the chat, we'll come back in 5 minutes, and then we'll give some instructions on the discussion groups. Any questions at this point? Oh, I see a question in the chat that I missed. These modules were created primarily for post-secondary students, my kind of entry level, and some of the activities are suitable for high school. So the main focus is post-secondary, but a lot of the things can be adapted. Okay, well, we'll come back in 5 minutes and we'll give instructions at that point. But if you're able to just take a look at the website and kind of look around, yeah. We'll see you folks in 5 then. Okay. So now that folks have had a bit of a chance to actually look at the website, we do have a couple of discussion questions that we were going to break into breakout rooms for. But we could also just stay in the larger room if people are feeling comfortable to engage with that. Does anyone have a specific preference? The danger of asking a question to a big Zoom room. Okay, let's go with the breakout rooms then, and then cool. Okay, either let's go with breakout rooms so that way. Oh, somebody said large room. Oh no. I'm thinking. Okay, we'll stick with the large room then, since one folks said to go with it, so we'll make that work. I'm just going to maybe.
Erin, I can post the questions in the chat.
Yeah, do we still want to use the Google Doc, and then if folks don't want to talk, they can just type?
Yeah, I can send the link to that right now, but I'm also happy to take notes as folks unmute themselves and share.
Great.
Awesome.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a couple of discussion questions that if folks want to engage that way, that's great. So Rachel will be putting them in the chat. Yeah, and I guess we can just start with the first one is, how can you see yourself or your organization using these modules? So this is kind of, we want to get people thinking about the modules, and then we'll also do a Q&A at the end if you have specific questions, but this is kind of our time to ask you folks what your responses are. And feel free to unmute or just post in the chat.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for organizing this and for these modules. So I'm a faculty member at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and I'm teaching a class in food systems and a class in sustainable agriculture, which also touches on food systems this semester. And I think I was sort of trying to scrape together modules that do some of what these are doing, but not at all in any way as well. So I see myself implementing these next year when I teach these classes. And it's just a question for me of then how to fit this into the rest of the things that need to be covered within the semester, and whether to use all of these modules or just one, and like kind of how to integrate that with the rest of a semester long course in food systems.
Awesome, that's so exciting. And Alex, you just started teaching there, right?
Yeah, this is my first semester. So I started in July. Yeah.
Super exciting. That would be really cool to have some of these show up in that course.
Yeah, I mean, any pre-made resources are great for me as I start. I've been hurled into online teaching, but yeah, if you want to, maybe I could be in touch with you too about how that works. Or actually anybody else who is working on that, I'd love to talk to how that proceeds for you.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on how folks can see themselves or their organization using these modules?
Yes, I can go next. So my name is Harveen, and I'm an educator currently with a nonprofit in Ottawa. Although we're operating virtually, so we're based in Ottawa and Montreal, and our nonprofit's called Genvironment, and we deliver sustainability education to young people, I guess from the age of like as young as 6 to 17 currently. And essentially we offer a platform for kids to raise their voice, express themselves, advocate for the issues they care about, and we tackle sort of everything in regards to sustainability, including social justice issues, as that is connected very much. And just going through the website and looking at the resources, which are so skillfully made and so clear and concise, I almost feel like, you know, with our Youth Sustainability Commission, our YSC, which is just a small handful of really, really bright kids, we could actually walk through this and they could pick what they want to look at and in a way kind of co-construct their curriculum based on the resources. So yeah, I feel like, you know, rather than me choosing outside on my own, I feel like I could invite them to walk through, because you give such a good snapshot of what's to be expected in each module, so they could get a sense, they could almost like sample a module, I feel, without, you know, going in to try and figure out where they're at and what they're interested in.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think like when we think back to the guiding principles about like a democratic learning environment, that kind of thing, like I think that totally captures that, and that sounds super rad. And these are the kinds of things I wish I had when I was that age.
100%.
Anyone else want to speak to how they can see themselves using these modules or engaging with them?
Hi, this is Craig from Kimberly. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, and this is my very first quick peripheral scan through what's on the website, but I'm teaching at the high school level in food studies, but I also teach social studies and other courses. So I can really see some of these resources as being really effective ways to make some cross-curricular connections, because we have a social justice stream for students that want to study social justice as part of their social studies pathway. And then we also have, of course, lots of opportunities to try and integrate Aboriginal ideas and Aboriginal content in across the curriculum. And I already see little bits and pieces that would really help for us to be able to do that more effectively. When we're teaching food studies at the high school level, the whole aspect of trying to really get kids to start to understand food systems is a challenge. So I think being able to make those kinds of connections will be really helpful for them. So I'm pretty excited about exploring the website and looking at the activities and all those resources. So thank you.
That's awesome to hear, Craig. Thanks. I think, yeah, what we're doing in the next kind of couple of months is, again, trying to make the language, make sure it's accessible. So I think that'll definitely help when we're looking at using it in high school or with other youth, is that making sure it's a good fit. So anyone else want to kind of say their initial thoughts?
I'd like to jump in if that's all right. My name's Camille. I'm here with my education manager hat on from the Center for Sustainable Food Systems here at UBC. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing in that role involves delivering programs to people of different ages and different expertise and different knowledge sets. So it's really nice to just at first glance have such a clear sort of tool to sort of use as a touchstone when figuring out what programming to deliver and how to basically assess and help people achieve some of the goals that we have that align with this kind of education. So I haven't obviously looked in depth at what you guys have presented yet, but it's quite an inspiring sort of tool at first glance. I confess that in my other working life, I also welcome to the jungle. We got fun and games. That was exciting. That's the dreaded Zoom bomb. I think that might have been what that was. Anyhow, in my other life, I'm currently sitting as the chair of the Vancouver Park Board, and we have a lot of initiatives centered around an equity lens and a decolonization lens for our policy. And I can see how a tool like this might be helpful in a context that's completely different than food systems as well, in that like there's kind of a frame here that can, I think, translate the goal setting of these, of these policies and the actual how to get there. And I think that that's kind of a soft spot in what I'm seeing in other realms too, is like, sure, like set the goal at equity, set the goal at decolonization when you're kind of developing these policies, but how do you go from where we are to that place? And I think looks just at first glance to see that there's tools embedded in here that can help me try to figure that out completely, like in a realm that's not even food systems related. So it's very exciting to take a look. So thanks so much for this. I'm quite impressed.
Yeah, it's exciting to hear just how people can pull from this in different applications as well. When we kind of started in one place and wanted to make sure that it was somewhat useful in other ways, of course there's limited, but yeah. Okay. And Helen.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having this webinar and showing us the website. It's I was interested in it from the perspective of a dietitian who speaks with parents and students, consumers, youth and people with chronic diseases, and they struggle with that, I guess, the cognitive dissonance between what they eat and maybe what their ideals are, and what they, the ideal of eating local, whole, minimally processed foods, and what's in the Canada's Food Guide, fresh vegetables, fruits, and protein foods, high fiber, whole grains, and then, well, do they feel guilty if they eat at fast food or at Tim Hortons, and at the same time, I do work with some vulnerable populations, and they might be having to shop at the dollar store or Walmart, and that's their reality. And so dealing with guilt, shame, how to not shame people for what foods they do buy or can afford, and having those ideals of what is presented in a sustainable food system. And there's so many lenses, like the health lens, the justice, environmental aspects. So yeah, I like to just sort of learn as much as I can about food systems, and thanks for the resources you've put together.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Yeah, I think part of this too is like people can also just go through these modules on their own time if they want to learn more about these topics. Like I think there's many different ways people can approach them, and even just in the background, if you're like, oh, I haven't really learned much about migrant labor before, like there's a lot there and a lot to build off of. So. Okay. Anyone else want to kind of answer the first question we posed, or want to move on to another discussion question?
Hi, yeah, my name's Karen Ageson, and I'm an urban farmer in Vancouver, Musqueam Lands. And so we have an urban farming learning program where we have multiple people in the community, often retired folks, and often students, a younger cohort of people that come and learn urban farming with us. And I've been wanting to pull in more food justice topics, not for just the folks that are growing with us all season, but also for the people that come and pick up their produce on a weekly basis, our CSA members. And so I've been kind of peppering our newsletters with topics of social justice and what urbanites really should be concerned about in terms of workers' rights for migrant laborers, and yeah, a lot of the food justice topics that you have in these modules. So I think the way I plan to use it is to go through the modules myself, just so I feel equipped to talk more knowledgeably about these topics, and then kind of pepper our field days and these communications with our CSA members with little bits of these modules, kind of in a less formal structure, but one that will really enrich what people get out of being involved with our programs.
That's awesome. I like how you're trying to put it into the whole community, not just one aspect of your organization. That's really, really cool to hear. Okay. Anyone else want to share what their kind of thoughts or how they're going to approach these modules?
Hi, I just really wanted to quickly sort of echo the sentiments of everyone else that's been speaking. I am a former early years educator, and currently I'm a pedagogist with the early pedagogy or early childhood pedagogy network. My focus is with environmental and ecological critical theory perspective. So just looking at your website at first glance, I do just want to note, I really appreciate that you take it up with a critical lens, because I do find, I know you can't see me, it's privacy purposes where I am, but I am an adopted white colonial settler. So I think a lot of the times when we talk about environmental issues, it comes through like a whitewashed savior sort of complex. So just again, first glance, even just at the glossary that you've offered, I think it's very thoughtful and does bring that critical lens where it's not just about what a group of, intellectuals can do in the name of others, but how we can sort of create the conditions for collective living, and perhaps certain people and demographics to get out of the way and let others who have been marginalized with these traditional knowledges speak up and be heard the way that they should be. So yeah, I know that was a lot in a very quick time, but I think for me, that's the biggest takeaway from what I've seen so far, and just wanted to say that I appreciate that greatly.
Thanks, Courtney. I think we tried to really balance like that critical lens, but then also having kind of hope and collective action and like what, not just get bogged down in the problems or the issues that we see. Because I think that was something as students, as we were approaching these issues, is it's really easy to just be like, oh, well, there's no place for a white person in the food movement because we're just terrible, you know, like those are things I've thought. And it's like, no, there is a place, like we need to be able to engage with these issues to kind of work through them. So we tried to balance that with the activities and making sure that it's not just critical analysis all the time, and also looking at how we can join movements and how we can work with others to address some of the issues we see. So. Okay. Anyone else want to share? We could also just open it up to question and answer if people have specific questions about anything that they saw on the website or the process behind the project. We're pretty flexible, so.
Do we want to put out the second prompt, Maren?
Sure.
Just posted it in the chat.
Yeah, we can talk more about the process behind the project if other folks are interested. Alex, do you have any specific questions?
I mean, you can wait till the end if you want to do the other activity first, that's fine. I was just really interested to learn, like you said, that these were, I think you said these were based on feedback from learners. And so I was interested to hear more about how you tested them and also maybe how they've been implemented, if they have been used in any courses at UBC or elsewhere, what experiences people have had already with them. But you can leave that to the end.
I'm happy to jump into that if other people don't have any specific things they want to talk about. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, so I guess the process, like it kind of just started off as like Colin and Joyce being like, oh, we could do a food justice student directed seminar. And then it was like, or we could make all of these learning modules and all these other things, and kind of spiraled from that, as good academics do, is just take on more work. But I think it was really like in the LFS core series, we do touch on these issues. So that's a series that everyone in our faculty has to take. And I think some people, Nikki and Sage, have probably been through that core series. And it does talk about food justice and engages with these issues, but in such a quick way. Like you have like one lecture on gender in the food system, and you kind of just like, it's just overwhelming and you feel like you can't really engage with it as much as you need to. So that was kind of the initial, what spurred this project. And then from there, it was like I'd had some experience working on the UBC Farms case study. So that kind of informed, I think, like the structure that they ended up taking. But it was really within the student directed seminar where it was a community of, if there was, Rachel, how many of us were there? 13, 15?
15, I believe.
15. So it was like a democratic learning environment in the sense that there wasn't an instructor. So we've been working on some of these modules outside based on what we saw in the syllabi that we looked at. Like we kind of took both what we wanted, like, oh, we never learned about migrant labor in our education, so do that. But then we also saw that some things were kind of across the board, like in the primer, some of those topics were showing up in a lot of the syllabi we looked at. So that kind of helped with the content themes. And then we trialed them out in the seminar. And for us, as this was the first time that we were creating these learning modules, that was a really good learning moment where we just kind of figured out, okay, what actually works and what doesn't. And then we revised a lot of the activities from there and also added in more details and that kind of thing, just to make it really, really easy for people to follow. And it was great because we had all of the reflections and we got feedback from the students who were taking on the modules. And then from there were some modules that we didn't get to trial. So that really informed how we developed the following modules after that. And then we're still working on a couple modules right now that we won't be able to trial. But what we tried to do was kind of take activities that people have already created or have already done and kind of tested, and then apply them in our context. So a lot of the ones in the primer and some of the other activities, we didn't necessarily make up or come up with on our own, or if we did, we kind of modified them from what we'd done, just because there's already so much resources out there. So kind of our role was to compile them together and kind of make them fit with like the backgrounder and like all of those things that maybe if you saw an activity online, you don't feel like you can really do it because you don't have that kind of lead up to it, or you don't have the debrief questions or that kind of thing. So that's kind of how I saw our role was to kind of do that scaffolding to make sure that like you're not just giving someone an activity and then saying, okay, go do the activity, and then not having the support around that. So I think like we trialed in LFS 350 as well, which kind of helped us also think through like ahead of time, okay, what do we actually need if we were just going to walk into a classroom and do an activity. So that was kind of the process. That was kind of a roundabout answer, but if you have any like specific questions, happy to dive more into it.
No, thanks for that. That's interesting to know.
Yeah. And then we did do a few community workshops with UBC Farm's practicum, their sustainable agriculture practicum, and then at the, I think it was the Richmond Diversity Symposium, we did some more community focus, so that there was less of like the reading discussion and that kind of thing, because in a community workshop, people aren't going to do readings ahead of time, but just doing the activities and having a discussion around that. Any other specific questions or an answer to the prompt that Rachel put in the chat? You can do either or.
Oh, one thing I just wanted to sort of say, I'm going through these resources right now in my other tab here. The activities are so fantastic, and I guess what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to translate some of them into an online setting, just because I know like with our organization, our programming is going to be online for the foreseeable future, which is not ideal, certainly for like the in-person, you know, that component of working out something together and seeing it together. But I do see so much applicability of these activities online using like Google Docs or a Google Jamboard or something like that. So that's just something I wanted to bring up, but it's exciting. Like a lot of it is absolutely applicable and transferable.
I think we had to facilitate a couple of maybe not workshops, but kind of a evaluation after, and using like the sticky notes and that kind of thing. Like a lot of these are kind of discussion based or brainstorming. Like I think some of the activities actually do use sticky notes in person. So you can totally do that on an online setting. I think there's just some of the more movement based kind of in your body activities that will take a bit more care to adapt to an online platform. But such is the life we're living these days. So. Cool. Any other specific questions or thoughts?
I'd love to jump in if it's amazing, this community that's already forming around this Just Food project. It's just really exciting to see. And I'm curious what you all have been thinking about next steps as far as folks are trialing these programs and learning and navigating them. Would there be some system for feedback and collaboration? Because even here we have a dozen people on this, you know, meeting. It's amazing. Everyone's coming from a really cool background. So I'm curious how you all view next steps of the project and how to encourage collaboration and kind of working together through it.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and also kind of a challenge with these grant funded projects is like our time on the project is finishing. So it's kind of like Will Valley is already doing a lot of this work and he's the PI. So he'll have, he has a postdoc that's doing a bit of the revisions. And I think that's a question is like, this came up during the interviews we had with instructors as well, as like, there's a lot of people who are educators who are interested in teaching about food justice or kind of establishing a community of practice. So like for this specific project, we have the contact form that we would love to hear from all of the people here, how you use it, and just tell us like how you're using it. And then from that, it's kind of a question of what could something bigger look like, I guess, like as this community of practice is emerging, is it another listserv that everyone gets, or is it, I don't know, like, is it, what kind of existing structures are there that we can kind of feed people into, because this is a shorter term project. But I think that's a good question. If anyone has any ideas on like what would be a good way to do that, because I would love to stay in connection with everyone who's using these modules, and that is just hard to think past grant cycles and past my role in this project, but people have thoughts.
Erin, could I also add on the potential of expanding modules beyond just food systems? Yeah, so I think a conversation we've also been having, and personally been quite interesting for me in the field of geography, is also looking at connections between climate change and food. And so, for example, the agriculture module is really interesting to me from a geography standpoint, because I'm looking at how climate change is going to disrupt agricultural practices, involving, you know, climate-induced migration and all that stuff. And I think I like that question, because I think that's actually the first question we've got about, you know, what we plan to do more broadly from here. But definitely, I think that interest, not just within the food systems field, but beyond in adapting these modules differently. And so I think that's why in that sense, it also feels great just to kind of put it out into the world and not have too much control over it, because it's really just free for folks to use the content in ways that would suit a topic of their interest in that sense.
Okay. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say something just based off of what Rachel just said. I think that's one of the greatest strengths of this, is that it's so accessible. Because if I think about a lot of other organizations, like I have to approach them to unleash their their documents, their resources, and they have to send an educator, which is great too. But again, it's all nonprofit funding. It's all, it's just massive restrictions around that. Whereas this, it's so generous because everyone can become an educator around it. And yeah, like we're not having to go through a middleman, for these resources. It's really powerful.
Yeah, I think that was kind of one of the goals, is when we talk about justice, is like who gets access, and understanding our role as being affiliated with an institution and having resources, and making sure that we can make sure that they're accessible. But Alex, what did you want to say in response to that?
Oh, I was going to say in response to just your original question, it would be cool to meet back together in a meeting like this after, with anybody who has used them over the course of a semester, like maybe a year from now. I would just love, it sounds like a lot of people are being introduced to them right now, and I would love to connect with, after I've tried them out and other people have tried them out, to reconnect with other people that applied them in different settings and see what we learned or get ideas from each other. And I mean, it seems somewhat, what's the word? It seems like somewhat related to what the Sustainable Agriculture Education Association does, which I know Will Valley is involved with. And so I don't know if there would be an opportunity to like tack it on to something they organize, but it seems like there could be some opportunities to stay in touch with a bit of a community of people who have used these and learn from each other.
Yeah, I think that's
even just like having some sort of community board function or even comment function on the website around some of the modules would definitely need some oversight, but perhaps a bit less, and that could cultivate a landing for a lot of ideas for everyone, because I would love to hear. If you guys get a bunch of comments coming your way of how folks are engaging with the website and the modules, like that's awesome, but it would be so cool to also hear that information. So maybe that's something that can be on the website or some other forum.
Yeah, I think that is a great idea, and I think that's something that we can totally find a way to make happen on the website and in some capacity. Yeah, I love that idea. And especially in the name of being able to share and keep things accessible, it would be such a benefit for everyone else who approaches the website too. So I'm just seeing Camille's comment in the chat. Oh, there was so many topics that were left on the cutting room floor. There actually, even one right now, I think we might be ending up making 2 modules for the agriculture as a colonial project, because there was just like so much we wanted to fit into that module, because it's both talking about how agriculture has been a tool of colonialism and agricultural policy and terra nullius and all of that, but then also looking at indigenous resurgence and foodways in response to settler colonialism. So that's a ton to unpack, and we think it's really important. So that might end up being 2 modules. Then I'm trying to think, I think we also had one that we wanted to do around alternative agriculture, because what we were seeing in a lot of like the food justice courses was talking about urban agriculture, but keeping it kind of limited. And I think there's a lot more that we can talk about when we talk about different forms of agriculture and growing food and that, and what does that look like with an equity lens or from a food justice perspective. And Rachel, again, was talking about doing like more of a climate justice focus and climate migration. So there's just so many topics that we could have touched on and that we wish we had time for. And even we have one on international food systems governance and kind of looking at a more global scale, but you could also approach that in a specific way of looking at food aid, and how that from an equity lens, what does that mean? And how do power relations act in that situation? So there's a lot that could still be turned into modules. I think that's the great thing about the wiki is somebody, I think right now it's only limited to UBC, but somebody could make their own module and follow our format and that kind of thing. And that could even just be an activity that somebody takes on. We even talked about like doing a directed studies where somebody could just make a module based on something they're interested in within the food system with a food justice lens to it, and taking that critical approach and just following the format that we've used. So yeah, there's a lot, and it was hard to kind of pin it down, but I'm also curious to hear if folks had other like, oh, I would love to see a module on XYZ. Anyone wants to jump in?
That was interesting to hear about what sort of got left on the cutting room floor, but I was also thinking about diverse opinions or maybe perspectives that are different than what you presented. And I think for high school teachers or even university instructors, how do you deal with those challenging questions? Or, you know, I just think about the political climate in North America, and just it boggles my mind, I guess, how people can think a certain way, and at the same time I try to understand why they believe that. And I like how your modules ask a lot of questions, because then it allows for people to come up with their own responses and hopefully have a respectful discussion. I haven't gone through all the modules, but I assume that through your questions and responses, you're presenting content that is both sort of pros and cons, or some people might think this. And so you're open to different perspectives, but also presenting the facts.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Anyone else have any, oh, I wish there was a module on, or I would love to take a deeper dive into this topic? Does anyone have any other questions or just comments as we're talking more? I think this is really great to actually have people look at the modules and hear their thoughts, like especially in the last few months when everything's been so removed from the people that we actually want to be working with. This has been really nice to just hear what people think. So I appreciate that from everyone.
Just reflecting on your question, Maren, about other modules, I think something Rachel said about connecting to climate and the climate crisis for me is something that, you know, I want to weave into everything that I do from an educational perspective. So I think that's something that I would love to see for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Just a simple addition, right?
Yeah, just an extra note somewhere. Oh yeah, climate crisis happening now.
I agree with that for sure. Yeah. Especially because like climate crisis education is starting to weave itself into the mainstream public system of schooling, like starting from, you know, when kids are quite young, and it's still very thin. I think it's still lacking and it's just a beginning, but to make that connection, I think would be so great. And then also the indigenous food piece and reclaiming that. I think that's really important from a reconciliation point of view too. I think I would love that if that was a module for sure.
Coming soon, hopefully. Definitely working on it. I think that was a priority, but also one we want to make sure we get really do it really well. So that's why taking a little bit longer. But, yeah.
I have a question. So you've mentioned Professor Valley a few times and the hopes to continue this, but also the realities of grant-funded projects that have end dates and funding running out and so forth. So do you see any opportunities for like building either further modules or furthering this work woven right into the core series of the LFS undergraduate program?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think a lot of these modules and activities, like we did trial them in LFS 350, so I think it would just take a little bit more work to align some of them. And we did at one point when we were applying for another grant was to look at like in GRS, which is my program, seeing if the program advisors there would support if students wanted to take this on as like a self-directed study or something where they could create new modules. So I think that's something that's still kind of in the back of our heads, is if there's enough interest or we can kind of have a conversation with the program directors there. I think that would be really cool to keep it really student-led. And there are a couple of other discussions with Will Valley of like how to do this given current resources and that kind of thing, because there is a desire to keep something going and to have some revisions. But I think it would be great if it could stay kind of student-led, which then takes more time, requires more resources. But I think that's what makes it really cool, is that this is students both like building their capacity to engage in these topics, but then also creating something that other people can use too. So yeah, that kind of answered your question a little bit, I hope. Any other questions or comments?
Just would love to somehow hear updates from people who are adapting these to online settings.
Yeah, and maybe I'm also just thinking on the website, maybe making a separate contact form for folks who are using the modules, and then we could even just have like a little, I don't know, I don't want to make another listserv because so many listservs, but maybe a listserv of just people or some kind of discussion board or something where people can just kind of more directly talk to each other than just comments. But yeah, I think that's something we could look into in the next couple of weeks of setting that up. Okay. Well, if there aren't any more questions, Rachel, would you be able to put the Qualtrics link in the chat if possible? I don't know if I have one. We just have a quick survey that would be about 3 minutes just to hear what folks think and to help us in our revisions in the next couple of weeks. I just want to say thank you, everyone. I am really glad we did stay in the big group because it was so great to hear all of your responses and to hear the interest and excitement around the project, especially the last couple months when it's just been typing away at a computer, hoping that we can eventually get them out. So this is really exciting for us, and we really appreciate the energy and excitement you've all brought today. So yeah, so there's the survey in the chat there. If you're able to fill it out, that would be really great. We appreciate any comments, even bad ones, whatever, just it's anonymous, so whatever works. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone.
I also just want to say, if we do end up setting up a listserv or a new page on the website, we'll make sure to share it with the farm, so that you guys will be updated on that. But yeah, I just want to echo Marion and say thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks so much for hosting this, guys, and for the resources. They're amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into it more. So thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, same. Thanks a lot.